The Golden 13, Recollections of the First Black Naval Officers. Edited by Paul Stillwell. Forward by Colin L. Powell. Narrated by Alan Bomar Jones. Copyright 1993 by the United States Naval Institute. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with U.S. Naval Institute Press and was produced in the year 2010 by Tantor Media Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. Forward. In March of 1944, America was in the grip of World War. The U.S. Fifth Army was fighting its way up the Italian peninsula. Men and equipment were assembling in England for a massive cross-channel invasion of Normandy. American forces were girding for a major amphibious assault on the Marianas. 2.5 million men were serving in United States Navy uniforms that month. 100,000 sailors and recruits were bursting the seams of the naval training base at Great Lakes, Illinois. Over 3,000 brand new ensigns were commissioned in the first 6 months of 1944 alone. The story of one small group of 12 of those new ensigns, plus one Navy warrant officer, might well have been forgotten in the sweep of world events that spring. After all, none of those 13 officers ever engaged an enemy in combat. None of them went on to achieve flag rank. They hardly knew one another before they were thrown into an officer training class at Great Lakes, and they went their separate ways afterward. Nevertheless, those 13 men made history. They had just become the first African Americans ever to be allowed to serve their country as naval officers. The history they made was more than just an event frozen in time, more than just a curiosity of naval lore. These 13 men, the Golden 13 they have come to be called, in fact helped to change the very face of America's military. On active duty in the United States Navy today are more than 3,000 black officers who walk through the door that the Golden 13 opened in 1944. The Golden 13 were not activists. None of them had sought to make history. The Navy's leaders had simply decided that it was past time to bring down the barriers to opportunity in the fleet, and as a consequence, these 13 sailors were plucked out of their separate lives to learn the ways of officership. Yet from the very beginning they understood almost intuitively that history had dealt them a stern obligation. They realized that in their hands rested the chance to help open the blind moral eye that America had turned on the question of race. And they recognized that on their shoulders would climb generations of men and women of America's future military, including a skinny 7-year-old kid in the Bronx named Colin Powell. This is their book, and Paul Stillwell has aptly named it. It is not the story of the Golden 13, it is their recollections. And it is not just the recollections of their time in the Navy, but rather their sense of what it was to grow up, to make a living, to be American, and to be black in the middle years of this century. This is a history of our country with the vivid insight of people who have rolled up their sleeves and really lived it. And Paul has done an extraordinary job of making these recollections as vivid in print as they were in spoken words. You will be touched by this book as when you read about George Cooper's mother, Miss Laura, feeding the hungry, white and black, in Washington, North Carolina. You will laugh as when Frank Sublette describes learning to sleep in a hammock in boot camp. You will cheer when the all-black crew of the USS Mason wins its duel with a U.S. submarine in an exercise off the East Coast. You will burn with anger when James Hare recounts the lynching of his brother-in-law in 1935. Most of all, though, you will be reminded that none of our lives is written on a clean slate. The opportunities that come our way, the privileges we enjoy, the very direction that our lives often take are shaped by men and women like the Golden 13, who came before us and who toiled to make the path a little clearer. Colin L. Powell, Washington, D.C., September 1992. Introduction. The 19th century is a good place to start tracing the background of events that led up to the commissioning of the first black officers. Back then, the Navy was essentially an integrated service, with black and white sailors living and working together. There were, however, no black officers. Many blacks served as enlisted men because there were no formal quotas or restrictions. During the War of 1812, the Navy's enlisted force was between 6 and 10% black. During the Civil War, fought in part to abolish slavery, some 25% of Navy enlisted men were black. The Navy's personnel policies and practices were much less formal in the 19th century than they became in the 20th. For example, mariners often moved back and forth between the Navy and commercial service rather than making a career of the Navy. They usually came from coastal regions and in many cases were foreign-born. The Navy was more concerned with manning its ships and shore stations than enforcing rigid segregation. And that is the real explanation behind the enlistment of blacks, not any great policy of enlightenment. The pool of potential recruits was so small that the Navy was willing to take whomever it could get. Even so, those black sailors were almost all in cook and servant-type roles, or in engineering ratings such as machinist mate or oiler. It was a time when service in engineering was clearly considered less desirable than on deck. There were a few black sailors in the deck specialties, right-arm ratings as they were known, but those men were exceptions. In 1899, as the Navy faced the prospect of manning its new Steel Navy, including a growing force of battleships, recruiting practices changed. The service inaugurated a category called Landsmen for Training. In this program, the Navy would take civilians without maritime background and train them for naval duty. Now men across the entire country became eligible for naval service. No longer would the Navy have to place as much reliance as before on foreign-born sailors, many of them illiterate in English. And as Professor Fred Harrod has pointed out in his book Manning the New Navy, it was also no longer necessary to enlist black sailors. As the nation moved into World War I, the war to make the world safe for democracy, the Navy became increasingly restrictive in its use of black sailors. Blacks still worked in food service jobs and cared for officers, but the engineering-type petty officers were more and more relics of a bygone period because those who retired or otherwise left the service were not replaced. It was essentially a segregated service because black sailors were likely to live and work in restricted enclaves on board ship rather than being spread throughout the ship's crews. As time passed, the Navy also decided it would prefer to have servants from some other race besides American Negroes, taking in Chinese and Filipinos as cooks and stewards. In August 1919, the Navy completely stopped enlisting blacks. The nadir was reached in 1932 when attrition had reduced the number of blacks in the Navy to 0.55% of the enlisted force. In January 1933, the service again began enlisting blacks as messmen, this time with the rationale that a war in the Pacific might eliminate the opportunity to enlist Oriental servants. The Navy preferred to take in Southern blacks because of the belief that Northern blacks were more likely to be educated and independent. Repeating a phrase that appeared in the official correspondence of the era, an officer indicated that recruiting in the South was likely to bring in the unspoiled young Negro. The Navy steadfastly held to the position of not allowing black sailors in ratings other than messmen, believing that if blacks advanced to petty officer status, they would not be able to exert effective leadership over white sailors under them. Even when blacks reached the level of chief steward, they had no authority over lower-rated enlisted men in the general service. Congressmen appointed 2 black civilians to the Naval Academy as midshipmen in the 1930s, but white officers at Annapolis soon encouraged them to seek careers in other fields. As World War II loomed over the United States in the early 1940s, Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox believed in the desirability of continued segregation within the Department of the Navy. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had named Knox to the cabinet for political reasons rather than for any great knowledge of naval affairs. Knox thus depended for advice on the senior admirals, a group that wanted to uphold the tradition of a segregated service. However, political pressure from outside the government were calling for increased opportunities for blacks in a country that seemed on the verge of war. Roosevelt thus responded to the threat of a planned march on Washington by directing that the defense industry implement equal opportunity. Pressures mounted on the Navy as well, so a committee was established to investigate the opportunities for blacks in the Navy and Marine Corps. The committee reported in December 1941, a few weeks after the beginning of U.S. involvement in World War II, that no changes needed to be instituted with regard of race. However, organizations outside the government, including the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, continued to exert pressure. President Roosevelt, more attuned to such political forces than Secretary Knox, began in January 1942 to push the Navy toward providing greater opportunities for black sailors. A factor in the process of raising the president's awareness of the need to increase opportunities for black citizens was the influence of Eleanor Roosevelt, his socially conscious wife. On April 7, 1942, the president's prodding finally yielded results when the Navy agreed to begin accepting blacks for general service ratings on June 1st. But that was only half a loaf, for these enlistees could serve only ashore or in small local defense craft, not in seagoing ships. Black enlisted men in the fleet would continue to be messmen only. Blacks already serving as messmen were precluded from transferring because of a shortage of servants. In late 1942, mobile construction battalions, the Seabees, began taking black enlistments. In February 1943, because of increasing demands for manpower, the Navy began receiving all its recruits as draftees through the selective service system rather than taking volunteers. Whereas the Navy had been able to turn down potential enlistees previously, it now had to take whatever men the system produced. That meant that the number of black sailors would increase until they represented 10% of the Navy, roughly proportional with the population as a whole. To accommodate the influx, the Navy created base companies for overseas duty. These were essentially groups of laborers, stevedores, ammunition handlers, construction workers, and maintenance men. In effect, the Navy established a separate branch to absorb black enlisted personnel to avoid integrating the fleet. Black sailors in these positions resented their status because they were like the messmen separated from the Navy as a whole and offered neither integration nor equal opportunity. White sailors resented the setup too, because they had to face the hazards of combat duty and black sailors did not. Meanwhile, the Navy was instituting a new program to beef up its training of officers for wartime service. This program, scheduled to begin on July 1, 1943, was known as V-12 and combined college education with officer training. Applicants for the program were due to be tested on April 2nd. Those pushing for the inclusion of black students in the testing program met resistance from the Bureau of Naval Personnel and Secretary Knox. Knox passed the buck upward to President Roosevelt, who directed in late March that the Navy include blacks in the testing. A number of blacks had excellent scores on the admission test and were admitted to the V-12 program. Thus it was that the first blacks were on the path to receiving commissions as line officers. It was a change in Navy policy that was kept extremely low-key. As James Snyder wrote in his history of V-12, the Navy issued no publicity, with the result that many organizations with an interest in the subject were not made aware that blacks were eligible for V-12. It was tokenism at its best. Probably no more than a dozen blacks were involved in the program in 1943. By the fall of 1943, the number of black enlisted men within the Navy was increasing rapidly, but the V-12 program was not scheduled to commission the first black officers until March 1944. Responding to external pressures, Adlai Stevenson, then serving as an assistant to Secretary of the Navy Knox and others, urged in 1943 that the Navy consider commissioning blacks as officers even more quickly than V-12 could produce them. Stevenson, who later distinguished himself as governor of Illinois, two-time candidate for president, and ambassador to the United Nations during the Cuban Missile Crisis, wrote a memorandum to Knox suggesting that, as soon as possible, the Navy commission a dozen black men as officers. The memo is reproduced as Appendix A. In fact, the first black V-12 officers did not come along until later in 1944, a group that included such people as Samuel Gravely, who eventually became the Navy's first black flag officer, and Carl Rowan, now a journalist of national stature. In response to the urgings of Stevenson and other individuals, Secretary Knox did agree to commission 12 black enlisted men as officers. These were the men who came in time to be known as the Golden 13. On a quiet basis, the hierarchy of the Navy put out the call for qualified candidates. To a man, those who did become the first officers do not know how they happened to be chosen. The best guess is that they were men who had distinguished themselves by their performance and attitude while serving as enlisted men. One of those who was among the first group commissioned, Dennis Nelson, later wrote a master's thesis that was published in 1951 as The Integration of the Negro into the U.S. Navy. Nelson wrote that Commander E. Hall Downs, officer in charge of the Naval Training School at Hampton, Virginia, chose 8 of the 16 officer candidates. Commander Daniel Armstrong, officer in charge of black training at the Naval Training Station at Great Lakes, Illinois, selected 7, and the commandant of the 8th Naval District selected 1. Great Lakes was a site of recruit training for black sailors. Hampton provided advanced training in specific occupational specialties. All of the men considered for the program, certainly more than the final 16 chosen, were thoroughly screened, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation conducted detailed inquiries into their backgrounds. Despite repeated requests for information dealing specifically with the selection and training of these first black officers, no documents have emerged from official sources such as the National Archives, Bureau of Naval Personnel, and Naval Historical Center. Perhaps the publication of this book will lead to the unearthing of such records from wherever they have been stored since 1943-44. Lacking such documentation, one can make several observations after reviewing the oral recollections of those who successfully completed the program. One observation is that even though Secretary Frank Knox was obviously reluctant for the service to have blacks in general service ratings and later as commissioned officers, the Navy did carry out the officer program in good faith once Knox agreed to the proposal put forth by Stevenson and the Bureau of Naval Personnel. Another observation is that all of the candidates had proved their proficiency as enlisted leaders. There were other common denominators, such as the evident willingness to accept discipline and obey orders. The Navy was not looking for militants in these officer candidates. The preponderance of the officer candidates were athletes, perhaps because the Navy believes there is a correlation between athletic achievement and leadership ability. On the other hand, the officer candidates offered a range of educational attainments. Some had postgraduate degrees, some bachelor's degrees, some had begun college but not finished, and some did not have a college background. With approximately 100,000 black sailors available at the time of the selections, the Navy could have picked, for instance, 16 men with master's degrees as officer candidates, but that would not have been representative of the overall population nor comparable to the individuals in the white officer training programs of the time. In January 1944, the 16 black sailors began their training at Great Lakes. The rationale for training 16 men was that officer training programs, including the Naval Academy, generally lose a certain percentage of candidates, so some extra men were included to reach the desired total of 12. All 16 men successfully completed their training at Great Lakes in March 1944, but only 13 of them became officers. In Strength for the Fight, an excellent book on the history of American blacks in the military, Arthur Bernard Nolte argues that the choice of 13 was arbitrary. The Navy had expected that 1/4 of the men would not pass the course, but all did. Rather than making officers of all 16 men, the Bureau of Personnel gave commissions as ensigns to 12 of the men and made a warrant officer of a 13th, a man without a college education. If the records of the Golden 13 do eventually emerge, they may well shed some light on Nolte's supposition. His claim of arbitrary treatment makes considerable sense, although it was hardly palatable to the 3 men who passed the course but didn't get the expected reward. These 3 remained on active duty as enlisted men and were reassigned to other duties within the Navy. Finally, 146 years after the establishment of the Navy Department in 1798, the service had its first black line officers. They were also the first active duty black officers, but not the first overall. On June 18, 1942, the Navy had awarded a reserve commission to a black medical student named Bernard Whitfield Robinson. He was a light-skinned individual, but it's possible that the officer who commissioned him did not actually see him. The Navy was competing with the Army for medical officers and decided to commission a number of students during their final year of medical school so that they would be available to serve on active duty once they became physicians. An internal memo in the Bureau of Naval Personnel explained that Robinson's commissioning was a result of a slip by the officer who signed up medical students at Harvard. One officer, according to the memo, says this boy has a year to go in medical school and hopes they can get rid of him somehow by then. Robinson did remain a Naval Reserve officer and became a doctor, but did not begin his active service until after the commissioning of the group at Great Lakes. For some 35 years after they were commissioned, the 13 men of Great Lakes were known only as those Negro naval officers, or later as those black naval officers. That is, if they were known as anything at all. In keeping with the low-key approach toward the blacks who entered the V-12 program, the Navy greeted the commissioning of the 13 with little fanfare. It had reluctantly made officers of the men, but it wasn't going to accord them any special treatment. For many years they really had no group identity. They had been together briefly in 1944, then had gone their separate ways. The first of the original 13 black officers to die was Charles Lear, probably by suicide shortly after World War II. Next was Philip Barnes, who returned to his home of Washington, D.C. following his naval service. He died in March 1955. Reginald Goodwin had a successful career as an attorney in Chicago before he died in 1974. After his retirement from naval service, Dennis Nelson settled in San Diego and was active in the Urban League. He died in 1979. Dalton Baugh got bachelor's and master's degrees after leaving the service, then set up his own engineering firm in the Boston area. He died in 1985. Lewis Williams, who went through the training but was not commissioned, had a master's degree by 1944 and had worked before World War II as a union organizer for railroad redcaps. These baggage handlers were not employed by the railroads and thus depended entirely on tips for their income. They had no salary, no medical coverage, and no pension benefits. Thus they had to work as long as they could to provide income for themselves and their families. Following his wartime naval service, Williams returned to civilian life in his hometown of Chicago and pursued a career in social work. I have no information on the men named J.B. Pinckney and A. Alves, who also were trained with the Golden 13 but did not become officers. In the mid-1970s, Dennis Nelson brought about a reunion of the group of men who had trained together and been commissioned together in 1944. He tracked down all but one of the surviving members of the group and arranged for them to get together in 1977 at Monterey, California. Captain Edward Seacrest, who was assigned to the Navy Recruiting Command at the time, was involved in that first reunion. Vice Admiral Sam Gravely, one of the early V-12 graduates, recalls that it was Seacrest who coined the term Golden 13 for the first black officers. It was a masterstroke because that label gave the group an identity. By the late 1970s, the Navy was far more racially aware than it had been in 1944. Now it was desirable to play up the service's equal opportunity success stories. As a result of Nelson's efforts in bringing the group back together, the service retroactively made heroes of the Golden 13. It publicized their achievements and began sponsoring reunions on an annual basis. They were called to meet the Secretary of the Navy, called upon to aid Navy recruiting, and in 1982 sent aboard the modern guided missile destroyer Kidd in a highly publicized visit. Interestingly, the members of the group are now much closer than they were in 1944. Back then they were so focused on passing the officer training that there was little time for socializing. In recent years, they have gotten to know one another as friends rather than as members of the same brief training course. In 1986, Lieutenant Mark Creighton of the recruiting office at the Great Lakes Naval Training Center visited the Naval Institute. His immediate interest was to promote coverage of black naval veterans of World War II, who were due to have a reunion at Great Lakes, the site of their training more than 40 years earlier. Lieutenant Creighton really set in motion much more than that. He inspired a series of interviews with the still living members of the Golden 13. In effect, this book is the story of the Golden 13, told by the Golden 8, because by 1986, only 8 of the men were still alive. All 8 were interviewed as a part of the Naval Institute's ongoing oral history program. In addition, the program has come to embrace 3 white officers who were connected with the group in various capacities. As valuable as oral history is for preserving recollections of events not included in history books and official documents, it is certainly not infallible. We all know that memory can play tricks on us, and that it grows increasingly hazy with the passing of years. Moreover, memories are reflections of the perceptions of a given time. Thus, if individuals perceive an event differently, they will remember it differently. A good example from these stories is that some of the Golden 13 recall their Great Lakes instructors as condescending, while others do not. The documentary records of the group's training, if they could be located, would be a valuable adjunct to the memories of the men who went through that training. Another pitfall of oral history is that the interviewer may not ask all the right questions. Fortunately, the men of the Golden 13 have been cooperative on this score. All agreed to a second round of interviews, at which time I was able to ask more knowledgeable questions than the first time. In addition, since they knew me better the second time around, they were more forthcoming in their answers. Altogether, the memories of the 8 black officers and the 3 white officers in this project constitute more than 2,000 pages of transcript taken from the oral interviews. In condensing that much material to fit the confines of a book, an editor must choose what to include. In general, the format emphasizes their entire lives rather than focusing only on their experiences together at Great Lakes in 1944 or even on their total Navy service. I have chosen to carve out excerpts that way for 2 main reasons. The first is to demonstrate the backgrounds that these men brought to the naval service, their experiences that had formed them and shaped their attitudes, the sort of guidance they had gotten from their parents, teachers, and associates. The second is to describe what sort of lives they led after leaving the Navy. As a byproduct, we learn much about society's treatment of its black citizens over the years. Since none of the interviewees made a career of the Navy, we must view them mostly in terms of their achievements in civilian life. By that standard, the Golden 13 are an outstanding group of men. And I think that a description of those civilian achievements helps demonstrate the caliber of men that the Navy chose for this program. They had a combination of native ability and motivation that made them successful. In other words, giving each man the opportunity to tell his story in broad, overall terms lets us put his Navy service in the appropriate context. Still, another facet of the editing is the desire to avoid duplication. Concentrating only on the events of 1944 would result in telling the same story over and over. Television producers have expressed an interest in dramatizing the story of these first black officers. Because of the nature of the medium, a TV drama will have to deal largely with the events of early 1944. It will depict the conditions under which the men were trained, the ways they confronted the challenges of an unfamiliar environment, and their interactions with one another. These were men of varying personalities, as will be apparent when actors portray them. That sort of dramatic focus will draw on other facets of the 2,000 pages of material than this collection does. Both approaches can complement each other. In a way, we might compare this editing process to cutting a diamond. The way in which the jeweler carves the rough stone determines the facets that sparkle in a given setting. Here, then, are the carved-out stories of the Golden 13. Chapter 1. The Importance of Inspiration. Graham E. Martin. For many years, Graham...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?